What if the love you were waiting for was already beside you, not trying to fix you, not trying to mold you, just quietly choosing you as you were? In your loudness and in your silence, in your fire and in your fear. What if the one person who never asked you to change was the one who changed everything, not by force, but by staying, by seeing you, by holding space for the parts of you even you had given up on? You never really know when a moment is going to matter forever. It never shows up with warning signs or fireworks. It doesn't announce itself as a turning point. It just walks in softly, uninvited, and leaves everything different. Two met them in the kind of moment you wouldn't think twice about: a quiet room, a cloudy afternoon, a shared silence that said more than words could. And I remember thinking how odd it felt to feel seen without speaking. They didn't smile like most people do not. The kind of smile you wear for the world. Theirs was slower, like it had to be earned, like it only bloomed when something real passed between us. And I was just trying to keep my head above the silence. I wasn't someone people stayed for. I wasn't easy to understand. I said the wrong things. I pulled away too soon. I loved too deeply and then shut down completely. I always felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Like loving me would always come with a warning label, but they never asked for a different version of me. They never flinched when I unraveled. They never offered advice when I fell quiet. They just stayed long enough for the quiet to feel safe, long enough for my edges to stop bracing for rejection. I remember the first time I cried in front of them, not the kind of cry you control, the kind that ambushes you, the kind you feel in your ribs, the kind that makes you ashamed of your softness. And I remember how they didn't say anything, no reaching for tissues, no rushing to fix, no turning away. They just sat there and let me be, as if my tears weren't an inconvenience, as if they were allowed to exist like I was allowed to exist. Strange how rare that is, to be witnessed without being corrected, to be loved without being reshaped. I had spent my whole life being told how to shrink, how to smile more, how to stop being too much or too sensitive, or too quiet or too intense. I was always too something, never just enough. But they never saw me as to anything. They didn't try to dim my fire or fill in the silence or label the ache. They just sat with it, like it belonged, like I belonged. Maybe that was the moment everything began to change. Not when they loved me louder, but when they loved me softer. When they made room for the shadows, when they didn't run from my chaos, but sat beside it like it wasn't something to fix, but something to understand. They asked questions no one had ever asked before. Not what do you do, but what are you carrying? Not why are you like this, but who taught you to be afraid of being seen? I didn't know how to answer at first, because no one had asked with that kind of gentleness, the kind that doesn't demand a response, the kind that's willing to wait as long as it takes. I waited to see if they'd disappear like the rest. Waited for the moment they'd say, "You're too complicated," or "This is too heavy," but it never came. Instead, they stayed, not because I was easy to love, but because they didn't expect love to be easy. They showed up when the world fell quiet, when my smile gave out, when my hope cracked under the weight, and they said, "You don't have to be anything more than what you already are." Do you know how rare that is? To be loved without earning it, to be chosen without performing, to be kept without pretending. There was a night late when the sky had that aching kind of stillness, and I told them, "I don't think I'm good at this whole being loved thing," and they just looked at me, soft, unshaken, and said, "That's okay, I'll be good at loving you until you believe you deserve it too." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I just let the silence hold us both, let the moment pass between us like a secret neither of us needed to say out loud, because that's what it was like with them. Not loud declarations, not promises or vows, just a consistent choosing, a quiet kind of loyalty, a love without performance. And slowly, I began to unlearn the things I thought were true, that I had to change to be worthy, that I had to be smaller to be safe, that I had to be happy to be loved, They taught me that. Real love doesn't ask for shape-shifting. It makes room, it expands, it sees the mess. And doesn't look. Oh, I started breathing differently when they were near, slower, deeper, like my lungs trusted them to there. Were days when the world felt too loud and I would disappear into myself, into old wounds, into echoes of things I hadn't healed, but they never knocked on the door of my silence. They just waited at the edge, letting me know I wasn't alone, letting me know they'd still be there. When I was ready to come back, they were the first person who never asked me to translate my pain into something pretty, who never needed my trauma to rhyme. They just let it be what it was, heavy and holy, and mine. And maybe that's the most radical kind of love. There is the kind that holds space for all of you. Not just the light, not just the laughter, but the shadows, to the quiet grief, the slow healing, the undone chapters. They never asked me to be whole. They just asked me to be here. And somehow that was enough. Some people love you in ways that never make a sound, but you hear it anyway, in how they stay, in how they listen, in how they don't need to understand everything to stand beside you anyway. They never rushed me, never pushed me to open. They waited. Not like they were waiting in line, but like they were waiting in a garden, knowing that some things grow when you stop watching so closely. I didn't know love could feel like that. Unhurried, unforced, unjudged. They noticed the things I thought no one ever would. How I fidget when I lie, how I laugh too quickly when I'm uncomfortable, how I hold my breath when someone raises their voice. They never pointed it out like it was a flaw. They just made more room, more silence, more gentleness. One time I told them I used to pretend to be someone else because being myself felt like a risk, and they looked at me with the saddest eyes. Not because they pitied me, but because they knew what that kind of loneliness felt like. They didn't say, "Don't feel that way or you're wrong." They said, "I've done that too." And suddenly, it wasn't just my pain anymore. It was something shared, something held together. There was a time I pushed them away, said something sharp, something meant to protect myself, and I waited for the fallout, for the leaving, for the "I can't do this." But instead, they said, "I know that wasn't really you. I'm still here." That broke something in me in the best way, because I realized maybe love doesn't leave when you're difficult. Maybe love isn't afraid of your sharp edges. Maybe love isn't scared off by your fear. They once asked me, "What does safety feel like to you?" And I didn't know how to answer, because I had never known it. But then they just reached for my hand, held it lightly, and said, "Maybe it feels like this." And it did. It really did. There was a night we sat in silence, stars overhead, and they asked me, "What do you believe love should feel like?" And I told them, "I don't know, but I think it should feel like you." They didn't say anything, they just smiled. The kind of smile that holds tears behind it. The kind that says, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." They never needed me to explain myself, never asked me to justify why some days felt heavier than others. They just knew, and their knowing was enough. They became the kind of home I never knew. I was allowed to have a place where I didn't have to be okay all the time, where I didn't have to entertain or impress or shine. I could just exist, and that was enough. They were there the night everything fell apart, when the thing I'd feared most finally happened. When I broke, really broke. I remember collapsing into myself, saying over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And they held me not tightly but securely, and whispered, "There's nothing to be sorry for, not here. Not with me." I don't think I'll ever forget that, the way their arms felt, the way their voice steadied me, the way my tears didn't scare them. They stayed through the breaking, through the unbecoming, through the storm. And I realized something. Anyone can love you when you're easy to love, but not everyone stays when you're not. They did. They stayed when I forgot how to be soft, when I said things I didn't mean, when I shut down, when I disappeared, when I lost faith in myself. They stayed, and not once did they ask me to change. Not once did they make me feel like I was too much or not enough. They never compared me to anyone, never measured me against their expectations. They just let me buy in that space, in that quiet. In that stillness, I found parts of myself I didn't know could lie. Started laughing more real. Laughter not the kind that covers the cracks, but the kind that comes from feeling safe. I started speaking more. Not because I needed to fill the silence, but because I knew someone was really listening. I started resting, not just sleeping, but resting. Because I wasn't bracing for disappointment anymore. They were consistent, kind, present, and I had never known consistency like that. Not in people, not in love. He taught me something, that maybe love isn't about butterflies or grand gestures or constant excitement. Maybe love, real love, is quiet, patient, safe. Maybe love is someone choosing you over and over. Even on the days you don't know how to choose yourself. That's what they didn't. Every day they showed me that I didn't have to earn love. I just had to allow it, that I didn't have to be better or happier or easier to love. I just had to be honest. They would meet me there always. I think the hardest door to open is the one we keep locked behind our smile. The one guarded by all the times we've been misunderstood, rejected, abandoned for being honest. But they waited by that door without knocking, without pressuring, just leaving. Light outside it every single day, until one day I opened it, not all the way, just a crack, but enough to show them the small, broken places. The fears I never spoke, allowed the guilt that still kept me awake at night, and they didn't flinch, didn't rush to fix it, didn't offer a solution. They just looked at me and said, "You didn't deserve to carry all of that alone." That one sentence undid years of silence inside me. Told them things I had never said out loud, how I thought being too emotional made me weak, how I learned to hide behind jokes and detachment, how I used to pretend I didn't care just to survive. They listened like every word mattered. Like they'd been waiting their whole life to understand me, and when I paused, ashamed of my own truth, they reached for my hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story." No one had ever said that to me before. People usually listened to respond. They listened to witness, to hold, to honor, and something in me softened. I remember we were sitting on the floor, cross-legged, wrapped in a silence that felt like home, and I looked at them. Really looked, and I saw it, the love they never spoke aloud, the love they lived in, how they remembered the little things, and how they made sure I ate on the days I forgot to care for myself, and how they never made me feel like I was a burden. Love doesn't always say, "I love you." Sometimes it says, "Text me when you get home," or "I brought your favorite tea," or "You don't have to talk right now, I'm just here." They once told me, "I don't need you to be perfect, I just want you to be real." And no one had ever said that to me. Not without meaning something else, but they meant it every time, in every way. We had a fight once, not loud, not cruel, just full of truth that hurt to hear, and I braced for the end. Because that's what I'd learned to expect, that honesty ruins love. That vulnerability drives people away. Instead, they said, "Thank you for telling me how you feel. Even if it's hard, I'd rather hear your truth than your silence." And I realized I had never truly known emotional safety until then. They weren't afraid of my darkness. They weren't scared of my past. They just wanted to sit with me in the now, to understand the version of me that still flinched, still doubted, still apologized for existing. They once said, "I love the way you see the world, even when you're quiet about it." And that made me cry, because I'd never thought anyone noticed, let alone loved it. They didn't want to fix my sadness. They just wanted to be beside me in it. They didn't treat my wounds like a project. They treated them like sacred stories, held gently, without judgment, slowly. I began to trust the silence between us, to trust that I didn't have to perform to be loved. I began to show up as I was, not as I thought I should be. Some days that meant messy, uncertain, tired, and they welcomed every version like it was a gift. Not once did they ever say, "You're too much." Even when I felt like a storm, they reminded me, "You are not a problem to solve, you are a person to love." They helped me rewrite the script in my head. The one that said, if I am not useful, I am not lovable. They reminded me I am loved even in stillness, even in silence, even in softness, and that changed everything. We shared quiet mornings. Coffee in hand, no pressure to speak, just presence. We walked under streetlights at night, talking about dreams and regrets and the little things that used to make us cry when we were kids. They knew the names of my fears and held them without turning away. They celebrated my small wins like they were victories for both of us. They taught me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just steady, kind, constant. They became the voice I heard in my head when mine was too cruel, too tired, too hopeless. There. Love didn't make me feel trapped. It made me feel free, free to be free, to heal, free to stop running, because for the first time someone had found me and chose to stay without conditions, without expectations, without needing me to change, just me as I am. That was enough. You never really know how much you've been holding in until someone gives you space to exhale. They didn't rush me, not once, not when I stumbled through my words, not when I contradicted myself, not when I cried for things I couldn't explain. They just stayed, and that made all the difference. One evening, I asked them why they were still here, still choosing me, still soft, still kind. They smiled like the answer was obvious and said, because you're worth staying for. It didn't feel like a line, it felt like a truth, one I had never dared to believe before. Remember how my hands trembled that day, how my chest felt too small for my heart, how something in me tried to reject their words because it was easier to stay broken than to risk being seen whole. But they looked at me like I was already enough, not almost, not one day. Now I finally asked myself, what if they're right? What if I really don't have to become anyone else to be worthy? That thought shook me because I had spent so long building masks, perfecting survival, sculpting myself into who I thought the world wanted. But this friend, they kept choosing the parts I had buried, the quiet wonder, the hesitant hope, the fragile joy I'd long forgotten. They made space for my joy, not just my pain. They celebrated when I laughed even more than when I cried. They once told me, your laughter sounds like forgiveness, and I didn't know what to do with a compliment so gentle, so precise. Started seeing myself through their eyes, not all at once, but in fragments. The way I offered comfort to strangers, the way I remembered the exact date someone's father passed away, the way I stayed up late for the people I loved even when I was exhausted. They saw those things and named them beautiful. They didn't need me to be happy all the time. They just wanted me to know I was never alone in the dark. They asked me what I loved about the world, and when I hesitated, they waited and then asked again, like my answer, Matai. Told them about books, about storms, about the smell of earth after rain, and they listened like every word was sacred. We built rituals, soft, ordinary ones, tea and silence, stargazing, and the cold notes left on mirrors, music shared without words. They made my ordinary feel extraordinary because they showed up for the little things consistently, tenderly, and when I pushed them away, on the days I couldn't believe I deserved love, they waited just close enough to be there when I was ready. They didn't guilt me, didn't accuse me of being too distant. They simply whispered, I'll be here when you're ready to come back, and I always did, because their love was a homecoming one. Night, I told them a secret, a real one, the kind that changes how you see someone. And when I finished shaking, ashamed, expecting silence, they looked me in the eyes and said, that must have been so heavy to carry alone. Thank you for letting me help you hold it now. That broke me and rebuilt me in the same breath, because I had never been met with that kind of compassion, not without conditions, not without agendas. They didn't turn away, didn't treat me like a project, didn't offer solutions I didn't ask for. They just stayed present, whole, loving, and I started believing that maybe I wasn't too much. Maybe I was just too much for the wrong people. They weren't scared of my depth. They dove in, unafraid of what they might find. They never once made me feel like a burden, even when I cried in the middle of the night, even when I couldn't explain what was wrong. They sat with me in silence, in pain, in healing. That silence healed more than words ever could. They taught me that love isn't always grand gestures. Sometimes it's just showing up again and again when it would have been easier to leave. They never made me earn their care. It was offered freely without needing me to perform for it. Remember the way they looked at me when I wasn't looking like I was something rare, something worth protecting. That gaze held me together on the days I wanted to fall apart. They remembered my favorite song and played it without saying a word. Just smiled while I teared up, because even that small thing felt like being seen. And when I asked, "Why do you remember these things?" they said, "Because they're part of you, and I love all the parts of you." That's when I knew this was different. This wasn't about romance, or expectations, or needing something in return. This was love. Pure, whole, unspoken. The kind of love that says you don't have to be anything but human with me. And I realized I didn't just love them. I trusted them, and that for someone like me meant everything. The strange thing about healing is that you don't always notice it when it's happening. You just wake up one day and realize you're not flinching at the same memories anymore. That day came softly, no lightning, no epiphany, just a quiet, unexpected moment of peace. I looked in the mirror and didn't hate who I saw. That was new. I had spent years dissecting myself, criticizing every flaw, every failure, every soft edge that didn't fit the world's sharp corners, but their presence had softened those corners little by little, kind word by kind word. They once left a note on my bathroom mirror. It said, "I hope one day you see yourself the way I do, but until then, I'll keep reminding you." That note stayed for months, taped with care, smudged by steam and time, but never removed, became my daily prayer. A whisper I didn't know I needed. Sometimes I still didn't believe it, but I stopped fighting it, and that was a beginning. I stopped apologizing for existing, for being tired, for needing space, for not being okay, because they never asked me to apologize for any of that. They made it clear that my presence was enough. Even when my energy wasn't it, as a rare kind of love, the kind that doesn't punish you for needing rest, the kind that celebrates your silence as much as your song. They saw my boundaries as beautiful, not inconvenient, and when I said no, they honored it without guilt, without question. That kind of safety unraveled years of fear. I started showing up differently in the world, not louder, not brighter, just more high. Let people see the softness I used to hide, the tenderness I used to mask with sarcasm, the vulnerability I once mistook for weakness. And every time I doubted myself, their voice echoed in my head, "You don't have to prove anything to be loved." It wasn't just words, it was the way they lived. They didn't demand answers, they waited for them. They didn't offer platitudes, they asked better questions. Where does it hurt? Who taught you that you weren't enough? What do you need right now? Questions that didn't seek to fix me, only to understand me, that changed something deep in me, because for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to be alone in my own mind. They remembered my quiet days, not just my achievements, the days I got out of bed, despite everything, the days I chose gentleness over anger, the days I chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. They honored those days like victories, like sacred ground, and I began to trust that I could be loved, not for who I might become, but for who I already was. Stopped chasing transformation and started noticing presence. I started breathing deeper, sleeping better, laughing more. My laughter surprised even me. It sounded full, unburdened, like light breaking through. They said I missed this sound, as if they had been waiting for it, not forcing it, just hoping it would return. I asked them once, "What if I break again?" And they said then, "I'll sit with you until you remember how to hold yourself again." That answer undid me, because all my life I thought love walked away at the first sign of struggle. But they stayed, not just through storms, but through the quiet moments when nothing dramatic happened, only slow, ordinary healing. They celebrated my stillness as much as my progress. They knew the names of my fears and didn't flinch when I spoke them out loud. They let me grieve who I used to be without trying to pull me too quickly into who I was becoming. They gave me the grace to be in between, to not know, to not be ready, and when I finally started to dream again. They didn't question it, they just asked, "How can I help build it with you?" That question felt like sunrise, because I had only ever known love as something I had to earn, not something that came with scaffolding support, shared hope. They believed in me long before I had the language to believe in myself, and slowly I began to believe too, not just in my worth, but in the future, a future that didn't require perfection. Only honesty. I began writing again, not for approval, but for myself. Began saying no without apology. Began letting go of what wasn't mine to carry, and they never once asked for credit. Never once said, "Look what I helped you do." They just smiled quietly from the sidelines, content to be the safe place I returned to again and again. Used to think love was loud, was fire, was urgency. But this was water, steady, patient, life-giving. Thee taught me that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stays on. One morning I looked in the mirror again. I whispered, "I think I believe you now," because I finally saw what they had seen all along. Perfection, not a polished version of me, just the truth that I was already enough. There are moments in healing where the silence becomes sacred, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of no longer needing to explain yourself. That's where I lived now, in a quiet I had once feared, but now treasured, and they still sat beside me in that silence, unmoved, unafraid, uninterested in filling it with noise. Was enough for them just to be near. Some nights we didn't speak at all, just sipped tea, stared at the moon, listened to the hum of a world still spinning, and still I felt more understood than I ever had in loud rooms. They didn't rush me anymore, not through thoughts, not through grief, not through joy. They let joy unfold on its own terms. Some days it was wild laughter, other days a small smile while watching raindrops race down the window. Both were celebrated equally because they understood that joy is not a performance. It is presence. It was in the way they noticed, the way my hands stopped shaking when I spoke, the way I no longer clutched my sleeves when nervous, the way I started looking people in the eye again. Healing didn't come with fireworks. It came with those small, unnoticed shifts that only someone who had truly watched you would see. They noticed everything, and not in a way that made me feel studied, but seen. One morning I found a note tucked into a book I hadn't opened in years. In their handwriting, it said, "You once said you'd never read this again. And now you have. That's courage too." I don't remember telling them that, but they remembered everything. They remembered who I was before the world told me to be something else, and held space for that person to come home. Because of them, I started keeping promises to myself again. Tiny ones, like drinking water, going outside, letting myself rest without guilt, and every time I kept one, I felt stronger, less scattered. It was never about becoming someone new. It was about becoming someone real, someone I could live with, someone I could wake up as and not want to escape from. They told me once, loving yourself doesn't mean you never struggle. It means you struggle and still choose to stay, and that stayed with me like a lighthouse in fog, because there were still hard days. Of course, their words I slipped. Days I doubted, days the past felt too heavy again. But even then, they didn't try to fix it. They just sat closer, asked if I wanted a blanket, a cup of tea, or simply someone to breathe beside. And sometimes that was all I needed, because healing wasn't about never breaking. It was about knowing who would help you gather the pieces. They never made me feel like a burden. Even on days when I couldn't offer anything in return, they showed up without needing to be seen as heroes. They were just there, present, patient, soft. They had their own storms too, but never used them to silence me. None. Somehow, in that mutual care, we built something sacred, something that didn't need labels, didn't demand definitions, just was a love that didn't seek to own, only to witness. I once asked them, "Why are you so kind to me?" And they said, "Because someone should have been." That sentence broke something open in me, because I had always assumed I had to earn kindness, that I had to pay it back immediately, perfectly. But they gave it freely, without ledgers, without tallying the weight of it. They gave love like it was air. Something we all deserved, simply for being alive, and that was the beginning of trust. I trusted them with the parts of me still healing, still uncertain, still unsure if they were lovable, and every time they met those parts with warmth. Not hesitation, they said. There is nothing wrong with you. Only things you were told were wrong, and that became a mantra I repeated on the hardest days. There is nothing wrong with me, just things I haven't unlearned yet, so I kept unlearning gently, deliberately. I let go of shame disguised as humility, let go of silence disguised as strength, let go of self-sacrifice disguised as Luvand. In that clearing, something new began to grow: self-respect, not rooted in arrogance, but in truth. Truth they had known all along, but had waited patiently for me to see on my own. They were never in a hurry, and because of that, I stopped hurrying myself. I gave myself the gift of time to learn, to unlearn, to bloom in ways that couldn't be rushed. And every bloom, no matter how late they celebrated, even if it was something small like finally being able to ask for what I needed, or saying, I don't know, without shame, they made those victories feel monumental. Because they weren't to the world, maybe, but to me, to a sand, they always reminded me, this life isn't about performing, it's about participating. Even if all you can do today is breathe, that counts too. So I breathed slowly, deeply, and sometimes I wept, not from pain, but from the quiet relief of finally being allowed to be exactly as I was. No more armor, no more pretending, just me and someone who stayed for who I used to be, not for who I might become, but for who I already was. And in that love, I found the courage to stay with myself too, because they never asked me to change. They only asked me to be honest and brave and soft, and I was. Some goodbyes never happen because the right ones never leave, and some stories don't need a perfect ending. They just need to be told in full, softly, honestly, until the echo becomes a home. And that's what this became: a home I never knew I was building. A life I didn't know I deserved, a love I didn't believe was possible, and yet there they were, still showing up, not just in the loud chapters, but in the ordinary pages. To the mornings we didn't speak, the afternoons we folded laundry, the evenings we sat in different rooms, just being. Yet was in the being that I realized something sacred. I wasn't surviving anymore, I was living, not because life stopped hurting, but because I finally had someone to hurt beside, and that made all the difference. Day I realized I didn't flinch at kindness anymore. I cried not because I was sad, but because I had spent so many years preparing for it to disappear, to turn cold, to turn conditional, but it never did. Not with them. They stayed warm even on my coldest days. There were still moments I doubted, still days I heard the old voice whisper, "You're too much. You'll ruin this. They'll leave like the rest." But now there was another voice, to softer, truer, the voice I borrowed from them, until it became my own. "You are loved just as you are. Stay." And so I stayed when it was easier to run. I stayed when silence felt like failure. I stayed when the past begged me to disappear. I stayed because they stayed, because love taught me how real love doesn't rush your healing. It doesn't hand you a mirror and say, "Fix this." It wraps you in quiet and says, "Take your time." That's what they did. They made space for every version of me, not just the healed, not just the bright, but also the version still learning how to look in the mirror without flinching. And I made space for them too, because love is not one-sided. It's a circle. There were nights they cried, and I held them without needing to solve anything. There were mornings they didn't want to speak, and I poured the coffee in silence, letting them exist without pressure, because love isn't only what you give, it's what you hold, and I learned to hold them gently as they had held me. One day they handed me a photo of us from when we first met. I barely recognized myself. My smile was tight, my eyes distant. I whispered, "I was so lost back then." And they said, "You weren't lost, you were surviving." That's brave too. They always had a way of rewriting shame into courage, pain into purpose, silence into safety. So I started writing again, not for the world, but for me, tiny poems, scattered thoughts, letters to the self. I used to wrote, I forgive you for not knowing, for doing your best, for trying to be loved in all the wrong places, and I meant it. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without punishing. It's letting yourself exhale after years of holding your breath. In that breath, I built something new, a rhythm, a life of peace I didn't think was possible. It didn't happen all at once. It happened one choice at a time, choosing softness over defense, rest over shame, presence over perfection, and every time I chose that, they noticed, they'd smile. Say something like, "You're doing it again. You're loving yourself without needing a reason," and I'd laugh because I didn't even notice. That's how healing works. You don't always feel it happening, but one day you realize the storm is quieter, the weight is lighter, the reflection is kinder. It's not because everything outside changed. It's because something inside softened. There's power in that softness, the kind of power that doesn't scream, doesn't demand, it simply stays on. They stayed, always. There was no grand declaration, no movie scene finale, just a quiet moment, 2 cups of tea, the sun warming the windows, and the feeling that I was finally safe in my own skin. I looked at them, and for the first time, I didn't think, why are they still here? I thought, of course they are, because some friendships are not built on explanation. They're built on witnessing. They saw me, and I saw them. Not the masks, not the performance, but the soul underneath. That's where love truly lives, not in the loud, not in the perfect, but in the staying, in the being, in the breath between words. Used to ask, what if they leave? Now I ask, what if this is real? And I let the answer be yes, yes to love. That doesn't ask you to shrink, yes to presence. That doesn't demand perfection, yes to staying even when it's hard. Especially when it's hardy. Don't know where life will take us or what storms still wait. But I know this sigh will never again question if I am worthy of love, because they answered that for me again and again and again, without needing anything in return. The kind of love that changes you, not with pressure, but with patience, not with demands, but with devotion. And now I carry that love in me, a quiet strength, a soft certainty that I am not too much, that I am not too broken, that I am not unlovably. Am human, messy, growing, and love, dexily as I am. So if you ever find someone like that, hold them gently, say thank you often, and let them see you, all of you be. 'Cause sometimes the ones who stay are the ones who teach us how to stay with ourselves, and sometimes the greatest love story is the one where you finally realize you were never asked to change, only to. Beyond that is more than enough always.